Good morning, friends. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our Healthcare and Medicine panel, Dr. Vidya Gopalakrishnan. Vidya, an undergrad from Osmania University, a master's from IIT Madras, and a PhD from Penn State, had had a stellar career in the area of pharmaceuticals, as well as you can say, overall in healthcare in general. She has worked for names like Cygnus, Aerozane, Alza Corporation, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, Neurolitis Pharmaceuticals, and right now, she's a senior vice president in Quark Pharmaceuticals. She will be leading a panel of some distinguished IIT alumni across different campuses who will talk about how healthcare and analytics has been revolutionized by advent of technology. Without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Vidya Gopalakrishnan. Thanks again, Vidya and the team, for doing this panel for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar. Since this is a cozy group, maybe all of you can come forward. Okay. All right. As Tushar mentioned, welcome to this panel entitled Healthcare and Medicine Through Large-Scale Data Analytics. So that is the panel we are in. And as most of us are aware, there's a tremendous amount of buzz about healthcare and AI and big data, data analytics, etc. So what I thought I would do is just set the stage for where the field is, and then we'll get right into the questions for the panelists. So healthcare and the practice of medicine is heading towards the 4P model. So personalized, predictive, preventive, participatory model. And this is based on using electronic health records and huge amounts of biomedical and omics data. So large-scale data, or big data in healthcare, refers to this huge amount of data that is being amassed from these electronic health records, medical imaging data, genomic sequencing, payer records. It's not just the scientific data, but also payer records, pharmaceutical research, wearables, medical devices, just to name a few. So, and there are three characteristics for the data that is coming from these kind of avenues. And that is the 3 V's: volume, velocity, and extremely high variability in the data. So despite this large volume, velocity, variability, huge technological innovations and improvements in they are allowing this complex healthcare data to be transformed into useful and actionable information. So big data is just beginning to revolutionize healthcare and move the industry forward on many fronts. So the changes in medicine technology and financing that healthcare promises will offer solutions that would improve patient care and drive value in healthcare organizations. But what this will involve is various stakeholders. I think many of you are here in the audience, such as providers, payers, pharmaceutical producers, government and policy makers, as well as the scientific and research communities. All of them need to come together, collaborate, innovate, and reinvent the design and performance of all their respective systems. So the technological infrastructure has to be built by this group to house and converge the huge amounts of data that is being amassed. And the prediction is that this data will grow to a whopping 2,314 exabytes by next year, by 2020. So, and then in addition to building the infrastructure, they also need to invest in human capital. So people like IT experts, data scientists, data architects, big data engineers, and several others need to enter in this field and guide us into this new frontier of human health and well-being. So the goal of this panel is to just offer a glimpse into this vast universe of big data healthcare revolution. Please help me in welcoming the esteemed panelists. Sunender Saxena, co-founder and vice president, sales and services at Inc. And he's going to be representing digital healthcare strategy and transformation. Avik Pal, founder and CEO of Cliniops. He'll be representing digital solutions for global clinical trials, data management, and analytics for this panel. And Anupam Datta Majumdar, he's Chief Technology Officer, Vice President Innovation at Omnicell. And he'll be representing medical diagnostics, imaging R&D, and business models. All right, so we'll delve straight into the panel. Okay. So to begin with, the first question, maybe we'll go through each panelist. If you can briefly describe the specific area of healthcare or medicine you are in, the kind of data you collect, and how specifically you use large-scale data analytics in your world. So we'll start off with Surinder.
Fine. Thank you, Vidya. So I'm actually a co-founder of IntelliH Inc. Prior to my role, I was actually an advisor at Cisco. And so I had an opportunity to actually visit a lot of the facilities in the world to see how the operations worked inside a hospital. And that's where I realized that the bigger problem is outside of the hospital, not inside of the hospital, which is patients who basically live outside the perimeter of the hospital. And that's where the focus of my company is. Company is IntelliH Inc. We essentially provide clinical operational efficiencies outside of the perimeter. We manage comorbid and post-operative patients. Deep analytics, deep AI engines built inside a solution to effectively, proactively manage these patients.
Hi, I'm Avik Pal, founder of Cliniops. So we are on the life sciences side, working primarily with pharma, biotech, medical devices, but also academia and foundations that run global clinical trials. Having said that, our data collection is more structured because it is very well laid out at the start of in the protocol and what kind of data we can collect and we cannot collect. So it ranges from simple demographics type data, devices data, pathology data, lab data, streaming data, Fitbits and other things. So all kinds of data, but it has to be as part of the protocol. And then in terms of just to lay the landscape, most of these trials are very global. So you actually collect data from around the world. A typical phase 3 study can have like 50 sites, and maybe 40 of them or 20 of them could be Africa, Asia, South America, and others, and maybe another 20 could be in the US. So there's a lot of challenges in collecting data because a lot of these countries are not very tech savvy or computer literate or other operational Wi-Fi access. So those are the areas where we focus on.
Anupam?
All right. Well, I've got two entrepreneurs right next to me. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'd consider myself an intrapreneur, if you will. Most of my career has been with large corporations. So I'm with Omnicell, and we're in the medication management space. So if any of you've gone to a Costco or a Walgreens and made a call to try to get your drugs, your medications, you probably touched some of our systems. Similarly, when a drug comes into a hospital and gets managed all the way to when a patient takes the medication, the robotics around it for managing those drugs, the packaging of the drugs, as well as all of the data exhaust analytics that's driven through much of our systems. And before that, I was with GE, both with the corporate research and in the healthcare business for a couple of decades. And medical imaging was a big part of the work we did. So when you think of the data today, right, Vidya mentioned exabytes of data in healthcare, right? People think of unstructured data from social media as being big, but if you just think of simple genomics and 8 billion people soon, there's a massive amount of data that's getting collected out there, and there's a huge opportunity that data analytics brings in the space, whether it's genomics, therapeutics, monitoring services, and certainly diagnostic services.
Thank you. All right, to the meat of the questions now. So, AI and healthcare, it's in the news on a daily basis, right? So I remember reading in a recent, fundraising effort, so let's talk about hype versus reality, okay? So the specific quote that I read in that article is, this is what it said. There's a lot of hype today around machine learning with hyperbolic promises that it will magically solve all of humankind's problems, and dire warnings that it will lead to the destruction of humankind. So what is, the view on this? So I'll, let Surinder answer this question.
Any technology that you basically come up with, and especially in a space which has been a laggard like healthcare, anytime you talk about new technologies, it's always, there's going to be a lot of hype. At the one extreme, you talk about a digital doctor, a digital specialist, an autonomous digital surgeon, for example. And I've had a very, very reputed investor say that doctors will be obsolete. That's the extreme view, okay? In reality, things don't pan out that way. And MD Anderson ran a very expensive experiment, which was trying to basically solve the oncology problem, cancer, okay? And they discovered after plunging in millions and millions of dollars that that was not the way to go. And the reason was very simple. The doctors basically, when they actually come up with the prognosis, okay, it comes with a certain decision tree and decision cycle, and they know the process that they went through, either through collaboration with other physicians to get to that stage. But when you have a machine and an ML application running through it, there is nothing that tells you as to what actually went into coming up with that decision that they have. So doctors will never trust that as much. But then having said that, there are a lot of spaces in healthcare where this is working exceedingly well. And there is no more hype that is associated. It's no longer in the hype cycle. You have imaging, for example. I've actually ran into a company that actually does prediction based on claims. So claims data, if you look at claims data, every hospital loses billions of dollars, cumulatively, on claims being rejected. But almost 70% of those claims are basically valid claims out there. So there is this great entrepreneur who's actually built an AI application, an ML application that basically even investigates or understands the adjusters and can predict, number one, coding, how to code it appropriately, and the likelihood of presenting it on a certain day. Present it on Wednesday, and this claim will not be rejected out there. So there is a lot of stuff out there. But I'll just close by saying that we spend about $3 trillion in healthcare. Right. And we know that about 40% of that is waste. That's about $1.2 trillion that is available for innovation, technologies, AI, ML, a lot of the spaces out there. And if you understand that space very well in the clinical and the operational side, that's where that inefficiency exists out there. You can solve a lot of the problems in healthcare using AI and ML technologies, which will be accepted in that space out there.
So that's a good segue to the next question. So this question is for Anupam. So can you name one successful venture in this space? And why do you believe it was successful?
Oh, that's tough to just name one, right?
I was making it easy by asking you to name one.
Just one, right? Yeah. Let's say in the space I am in of medication management, I thought the acquisition of PillPack by Amazon was fairly disruptive, right? Both Walmart and Amazon were going after PillPack. This is a $100 million revenue company. It packages pills and mails it to you. But the day that acquisition happened, and within that week, more than $10 billion of market cap was lost by the big players of CVS, Aetna, Walgreens on that day. So I thought that was fairly disruptive. On the other hand, you look at what Craig Venter's doing with HLI, right, where you scan 35,000 people and he's doing radiogenomics, right? Yep. You do an MR scan and you do a full genome sequence, and you talked about variability. That is poised to disrupt, how we think of medication from being reactive to being proactive. So there's some wonderful opportunities, more than 19 unicorns in the space already. So there's a lot, pace of disruption is going to accelerate quite a bit in the coming years.
Okay. Thank you. Then now, Another provocative question. So, we've been reading about companies like Facebook and Google in connection with privacy, in the consumer data space, right? I mean, the rampant use of consumer data for, furthering their interests. So, and healthcare, has more of the confidential information, so with this whole data mining, et cetera, how do we ensure that patient data, which forms the basis for any AI healthcare platform, is kept secure and used only for patient benefit? Avik?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of recent noise and turmoil on that space. So coming back to our domain, there are two types of data that we typically use. One is the PHI data, protected health information, and the other is the clinical data, which is required for the research. And the sponsors, the pharma, biotech, medical devices, they only should have access to the clinical data. And PHI data, if it comes to them, is a liability, right? So there's a lot of workaround that the current process involves, which is, most sites, as I was saying, because of this global nature, they are not able to collect data at source, which is at the point of care, on a digital system for various reasons, right? So they collect on paper first, they get it transcribed, and there's a lot of downstream activities, and that costs the whole industry a lot of money, a waste, basically. And now what we have done is, fortunately, FDA has published guidelines along those very recently after a long wait. It's called eSource guidelines. We follow those. What it does is it enables the sites to collect data digitally and still be compliant with FDA, right? So they don't need paper footprints anymore. Earlier, it was a requirement. Now, if you can collect data digitally at the point of care, then you can solve a lot of these problems, right? And that's why we have come up with a mobile device-based data collection, completely offline data collection, and a whole bunch of other controls to ensure the safety and security of the data. And if you collect data digitally, then when you upload, then you can actually segregate the two, right? So the clinical data goes to a certain set of users who has access to it, which is the sponsors, the pharma. And the PHI data for each of the sites, so let's say there are 30, 40, 50 sites around the world, each stays within the purview of their own site, right? So earlier what happens is the sponsor would have to send monitors to all these different sites because data was first collected on paper and then transcribed, so they have to make sure that the two match. Is something called SDV, source data verification. It takes away 30–40% of the whole clinical trial drug to market budget. So a lot of that can be now done digitally, right? So that's basically where we focus. Now, having said that, compliance and security are very key. Now, in a startup, you have to kind of balance that, how much of the budget will go to innovation, a limited pool and resources versus how much we can go on the compliance side. But we don't have a choice, right? We have to make sure that they are compliant, and that's why, the sites will start using you. So we went through that whole process right from the early stages in terms of HIPAA compliance, in terms of FDA 21 Part 11 compliance, in terms of CDISC and the digital compliance, and then we went through full audit through KPMG, and now we completed the ISO certification. So this whole process runs in parallel to our innovation or product development to ensure that we take care of the data the right way. Leave it there.
So and there's some level of control because of it, supporting clinical studies, which is more regulated.
Yeah.
But then when you get into, like all the stuff that you get on your Fitbits and, Apple Watches and everything. So that is where the challenge lies in terms of, the HIPAA compliance and
very true.
Control. Okay.
Excuse me.
How are we doing on time? So I have a couple more questions, before we turn to the audience. So the next question is on the business model. So, the healthcare, we all talked about, how expensive and all these hidden costs for any medical treatment. So, now there is talk about AI, the use of AI helping to accelerate transition, from earlier this whole medical payment system was called a pay-for-performance, based system. And now the talk is about transitioning towards a value-based system, meaning you measure how much value you create for the amount of payment, So in terms of transitioning from this, pay for performance towards, value-based healthcare system. What are your thoughts on that? So maybe I'll let Anupam answer this.
Sure. A couple of weeks back, I was at a VC meeting that Deloitte had organized, and I was on that panel. And it was instructive for me to think of how does a VC think of value, right? And the model they used was actually very instructive for me. They said, think of a triangle, right? Especially here in the Bay Area where you've got so much dialogue on AI and data analytics. Let that be one part, right? The second part is workflow, and the third part is data, okay? And they said, look at the balance of the business model that the company is proposing, right? And their take was very simple. If you see that point really go more towards AI rather than workflow and data, please stop your meeting and run as fast as you can, right? Because if you don't know what problem you're going to solve, you're really going to struggle making money, right? And despite that pithy, simple way of thinking, there are a lot of companies that still do that. That's their value proposition, right? On the other hand, if you start the thinking around what's the workflow, do you have the data to answer that question, and now let me figure out the technique to solve it, right? That's a very different model of making an impact, if you will. So value at the end of the day is a pretty simple equation, if you will, outcome divided by cost, right? And the sexy part of healthcare has been, I'm going to cure cancer, right? So let me run after outcome. But there's such a huge need with the 30-40% waste around cost. So there are some really innovative models coming out, right? The commissioner of CMS, Seema Verma, she's really been pushing to free up data, right? That the patient should own their data regardless of which health system they are in. And that's bringing some really interesting fintech models, right? So Clover Health, that's looking at Medicare population, right? And Medicare Advantage population. They manage 40,000 lives right now, right? There are other similar fintech companies that are coming in and really looking at the edges, right? People who don't have the money or seniors who don't have an income source, right? So there's so many business problems to be solved in healthcare, but you got to do it within the regulations of healthcare. And that's where the innovation really comes in. So, it's a fascinating topic ready for disruption.
Right. And that is where I think Amazon was trying to disrupt, right, with their acquisitions.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Thank you. The next question we will talk about is social impact. So how can AI be used to increase access to healthcare in hard-to-reach areas, remote areas? Avik?
Yeah, so in clinical trial, there are three kind of stages. First is the study startup, study conduct, and then study closeout. And I think in all of these areas, there's a lot that can be done through AI ML, which is currently not there as much yet. Towards the end phase, there is, because that's like published data, and you can mine that data, get a lot of insights. Even for failed trials, you can get a lot of insights to make your next trial better. So a lot of work has been done there. But in the other two, the prerequisite for AI, I believe, is actually getting data digital and getting data real time. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge, especially if you're doing global trials, large-scale trials, studies with sites in Africa, Asia, South America, of course, US. So there, unless all these data from all around the world are actually on the system, there's nothing you can do. So the last data that comes in delays the whole process. So you cannot run any analytics unless you get the DB log or database. So those are kind of the key areas, right? And a lot of these things require real-time analytics to make decision support systems. For example, one example I can give is we're working with a big academic institute with a government in Africa on pregnant women, right? So for the sponsors, identifying risk ahead of time is a big thing. So they get a lot of value by that, right? And if something goes wrong, there's a lot of bad press. So you would want to kind of avoid that, right? So if you're running this trial, and let's say of every 100 patients, there are 5 moms who has a tendency for early pregnancy, right? If there's a way we can detect that and let the doctors know ahead of time so that they can give more care to them, and so that's a big advantage. And these are the applications I'm talking about where AI can make a big difference in these real ongoing trials, real time, because now that you have data which is digital and near real time, if I may, because they collect data offline through our system and they can sync it as soon as possible. So typically 6 to 12 hours. Earlier it was 6 to 12 weeks. So that's a big, big difference. And that's way too late before you can say adaptive clinical trial, right? So if you know that certain type of segment population is working better than the others, you can adapt only if you know that what is working and what is not, right? So these are different AI ML applications in the running clinical trials. Later I mentioned, right, once they're published, there's a lot we can do in, mine the data. Even before, how do we enroll patients? So that's another huge area where, many studies actually fall short because not enough patients. So that's where EMR data and all these existing data, if you know the markers that are required, okay, we need patients with X, Y, Z criteria, we can run these analytics quickly and say, okay, these 5 hospitals has higher chance of getting the type of patient that you're looking for, right? So there's many applications that you can use over time, but the point being that for the conduct, which is the actual clinical trial, getting it digital and on real time is a key, and that's one of the areas that we're working on. Thank you.
And last question for the panelists. So let's talk about what the key enabling factors, for example, business models, innovations, collaborations, et cetera. What have the key enabling factors been for the level, the degree of interest, of the use of AI in healthcare? So, Surinder?
Yeah, so I think when you look at enabling factors in healthcare particularly, it's driven by what I call as 3 legs of the stool. One is process, the other is economics, and the third is technology. And technology is the smallest driver of innovation in healthcare. As Anupam said, process is key. If you basically build a solution that does not intersect with the process, it's not going to be adopted, number one. Number two, if you build a solution that does not make economic sense, because healthcare is primarily driven by reimbursements. So if there is no CPT code, that technology will not get into the healthcare domain regardless of what you do out there, okay? So these are 2 factors that we basically look at, process and economics, okay? And then you balance your technology according to these 2 dimensions, or these 2 legs of the stool. But there are other factors that you have to start looking at in terms of, managing. For example, how do you democratize? You talked about access, right? Democratizing, AI in healthcare, big issue. This is another area of this thing. So when we look at, for example, patients outside the perimeter of the hospital, they are managed by and large, okay? But they take 2/3 of the expense of your healthcare system. So how do you bring that piece of that puzzle into your equation out here to see how you can be more proactive with someone and have access out there, and then be proactive in being able to manage that profile, that population health, or the population of patients, this thing. How do you do dynamic risk stratification of patients who are not in your facility? You do that very well inside the hospital. You don't do that very well outside of the hospital. So can you leverage technologies, AI technologies, based on monitoring data? So you monitor patients, remote patients on this thing out there, and then can you actually do more predictive models out there on their risk, their propensity to basically things. So we, for example, one of the facilities, they've asked us very plain and simple, can you predict 7-day, 30-day, 60-day mortality of the patients out here, okay? And we are building, in part of our solution, we're building those kinds of things out there, because it has a very different economic connotation for those facilities and for the system out there.
Right. I do have to comment on, the fact that technology plays such a, a smaller role, but in the whole genomic space, I think the leap happened, with technological, drivers, foundation medicine, they were able to figure out how to sequence all this genomic data at a very rapid pace. Otherwise, it used to take so much time. The cost was so exorbitant. Right. Now, you send a sample of saliva and they can, send you, your ancestry and everything. So there was, some component of technology there.
Sure.
Anyway, so are we out of time? Okay. So anyway, so I would like to thank the panelists. Sorry, audience, we didn't have time for your questions. As you can see, it's an ocean, and this was only the tip of the iceberg. So if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to ask them during the break. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Friends, we'd like to thank Dr. Vidya Gopalakrishnan and the panelists, Suren Saxena, Avik Pal, and Dr. Anupam Datta Mazumdar for covering such a vast area in such a small period of time and focusing not just upon the technology but also other aspects which are kind of influencing the industry. But love the comments, especially from everybody on artificial intelligence, an area that I myself love. Thanks a lot, and we have gifts for the panelists.